Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning. Welcome everybody to our next video lecture, and this one will be on global strategy. We'll be continuing our discussion of the various steps that are important for an international company as we review now some very fundamental and key ideas for global strategy. These ideas that I'll be presenting to you today are really quite fundamental, as I've mentioned already, and what we might say are the central elements to a global strategy. They encompass some of the very core ideas that are elemental to the development of the strategy, but more critically, the structure of a multinational company. Now, some of these challenges are becoming more pronounced over time in terms of some of the nuances of the structure, and some of them are becoming simpler, depending on the product and the evolution of the industry. Now, I can't answer which is which by product, because that comes from the application of these ideas to the particular industrial and corporate setting that you have within the company. But still, I think it's important to relay these fundamentals to you before we have a full idea of what will be evident in your own particular global strategy, which of course will be evolving. Some of these ideas we'll explore through various kinds of cases and discussions so that they'll be more meaty. But for right now, let's focus on understanding the concepts and the general ideas, which will then facilitate their application. Before we do that, however, we need to think about where this sits in many of the themes that we see in global strategy and in international business in general. These themes are some topics that we have covered, others we have not covered. For example, we have this interesting theme that's emerged recently about born global firms. Born global firms. For a long time, there was an idea that a firm or a company will always begin its operations entirely on a domestic basis. Entirely on a domestic basis. This means its customers, its suppliers, its financing, everything is related to local markets. But around the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was an idea that some firms are just born global, and they're immediately immersed in international markets. Hence, the idea of domestic becoming international is not relevant to these companies. It's simply a matter of how international they are and how they will succeed in international markets. Another theme which we have explored are the idea of partnerships and their relationship to international expansion. Partnerships and international expansion. We know that partnerships can manifest themselves in any number of ways. They can be licensing agreements, technology transfer agreements, can be joint ventures. Some people might even conceive of acquisitions as being a form of partnership, although I'd be less prone to say that, because an acquisition is a merger of two firms into one firm. And we can also consider items such as outsourcing or offshoring as partnerships as we begin to disaggregate the value chain, something that was very common through the last 2 decades, but is becoming less common now as some of the challenges and frailties that are created in an organization and its resilience are exposed in the present day in this fracturing of value chains and the consequent loss of control and coordination that can occur. But in any case, we always have to think about when we have these partnerships, how we can structure them and how we can use them to our advantage. Partnerships are an integral part of the internationalization process. Then also we want to think about the key theme we'll be covering today, although I'll review 2 more themes before I start talking about this one, which is local versus global. This is the fundamental challenge to me, and I'm sure to many others, that encompasses the management of multinational enterprises. How local do we want to be, and how global do we want to be? It's a key tension, and it is never ever solved. It's only temporarily resolved given where a company is in its internationalization process. Hence, for every company, they will be talking about the local versus global, whether it's downstream or whether it's for upstream operations. They'll be talking about this all the time. Local versus global for operational issues, for financing issues, for CSR-related issues, for stakeholder consideration issues. We'll see these surface again and again and again and again. And it is a tough management challenge. To me, because of the difficulties in examining these kinds of trade-offs that occur, This is where a senior manager or a senior leader in the multinational corporation makes their money, earns their keep, because there's no clear answers. And that's what we'll discover through subsequent discussions. There's no clear answers. There's only better and worse answers, but there's no best and there's no worst answer. And a lot depends on how you prioritize certain kinds of issues when you try to balance these various kinds of trade-offs. Then, of course, there's something that's at the top of everybody's minds today, which is, how does technology influence the internationalization process? What's the relationship between technology and internationalization? Technology provides opportunities to scale quickly, but there's also ideas about how do we localize technology. Even companies that are so-called born global in e-commerce space or elsewhere still have challenges to internationalize. And we'll see this through some of the very examples that we'll examine in the context of some of the companies we study. For example, when we think about Lazada, how do they use technology to internationalize? How do they connect to their parent Alibaba? And how does this all drive the process? Is technology critical to this? Does it have to be localized? What aspects of the company have to be localized? And so forth. Then finally, as connected to the idea of local versus global, or local versus global, yes, is also the idea of regional versus global. Now, once a company starts to internationalize, should it take the very next step to move beyond its regional safe haven, so to speak, or regional comfort zone, to go more global? The reality is that there's very few companies that are truly global. Most of them are regional. In other words, they come from their home country, they expand into the related countries in the region, but then they have troubles taking the next step beyond that to become truly global players. Truly global players. It doesn't mean there are not many global players or any global players, but it does mean that there's more regional than global players. In any case, let's think about why we might see this idea of global versus local. Global versus local. One of the reasons we see this comes from this debate that has been going on, but was started quite a few years ago, about whether the world is flat or spiky. Okay? What this refers to, or what these words are supposed to connote, is an idea that a flat world is one in which companies and people can easily globalize. It's flat because there's no impediments, and it's because there's no differences. A spiky world is one in which there are manifest differences and manifest barriers to the globalization of production, to the globalization of people, to the globalization of financing, to the globalization of ideas. In other words, a spiky world is one that is less likely to become more homogenized, or put another way, a spiky world is a world that is less homogenized and therefore less global. A flat world is global. Now, many writers have taken the idea that, hey, the world has become more flat. If we go back, way back into the past, well, not so far back into the past, but say 20 years ago, there was some writing that talked about the 10 forces that flattened the world. The 10 forces that flattened the world. You can see how old by the events that are referenced. For example, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which is both a symbolic and real event, or the emergence of Netscape, which largely was the first browser that enabled people to navigate the World Wide Web easily, workflow software, uploading information, outsourcing, offshoring. All of these were emerging in the late 1990s and early 2000s that created the idea that the world was becoming less spiky. The spikes were being rounded, the heights of the spikes were being reduced, and consequently there were fewer barriers towards internationalization. Moreover, there was a belief that these would continue to move towards a de-spiking or flattening endlessly. But we've seen in the present day that, hey, maybe new spikes could emerge for a variety of reasons. They could be policy-related reasons, they could be pandemic-related reasons. There's lots of opportunities for these spikes or barriers to emerge that could forestall the internationalization process. So as a consequence, some people have argued, hey, the world is still spiky. Others say it's flat. So I'm not sure what you believe, whether it's flat or spiky, and there's no clear resolution to this debate. But one thing you have to think about is that what does your conclusion about the nature of the world, whether it is flat or spiky, mean for the operations of your company? If you think it's flat, then what strategy and structure do you use? If you think it's spiky, what strategy and structure do you require if you are going to be international? And there's profound differences in the consequent strategy and structure that you adopt depending on your conclusions on whether the world is flat or spiky, or how flat or how spiky the world is. And that's really what we arrive at when we start thinking about how we structure the multinational corporations. It's predicated upon how much variances and where those variances arise between countries and how we adapt to them consequently with our strategy and structure. That's reality. If there were no differences international, then this would not be a system of debate at all. It'd be a matter of just simply, can we scale up to meet the demand? But it's more complicated than that, because scaling up to meet the demand is not easy when there's variances in either the production process or the nature of consumers across different markets in the world, hence the spikiness. When we've thought about the flat and spiky, then we need to go back to our strategy and our strategy model. Some of you might have seen this strategy process model before, where we think about our objectives, our vision and mission, how we develop strategy, and then how we implement strategy. Right? You might have seen this model before and think about all of these issues as also affected by the external environment. If you want to call it pestle, if you want to call it institutions, as I have advocated here, but how it's affected by the business environment. At the end of the day, the responsibility of the manager or the leader is to position the organization in competitive space, prioritize activities, and then align the organization. And when we think about the strategy and structure debate, what we're thinking about is how we're going to implement that strategy in a multinational firm, how we're going to create alignment, how we're going to plan for our implementation of our strategy, how we're going to communicate it, how we're going to monitor it, but actually what structural elements and other elements at the design, at the hands of the managers, will be used to create that organizational model that will succeed in a flat or spiky world. Hence, we have the flat or spiky, we feed it as part of an underlay to our strategy process, and then very critically, when we're designing the organization, we must keep this in mind. The cognizance of what is a strategy, what are the impediments or facilitators to that strategy through whether the world is flat and spiky, and what creates the flatness or the spikiness, and therefore envelop it in our structure. Now, a bit odd, maybe sounding, and a bit maybe indefinite, so we're going to have lots of examples to explain this, but to help put, again, meat around that skeleton. And the one area we want to focus on with some intent is the structure of the organization. All of you are embedded in organizations that have a very specific structure. Organizational structure is long a topic of managers and leaders. It's a very tangible topic. We know that there are right and wrong structures. We know that structures facilitate behaviors and relationships in an organization. They're not the only element that can do so. We have to think about various processes, such as incentives, what's the culture of the organization, and so forth. But structure is one of those key touch points that link environment, objectives, strategy to achieving that strategy through the implementation of it. We can think of some kind of archetypes of hierarchical structures, like the classic M form. We can think about the matrix organization that has emerged, or even kind of network organizations, which are very messy. Okay? So before we start talking about the archetypes of international structure that can implement various kinds of strategies given a flat or spiky world, we want to think about, why do companies engage in international expansion and global expansion? Now, we've already talked about this to some degree in the motives to international expansion, but what we want to think about here are some general underlays to this, which will then be achieved more easily. In other words, these kinds of basic benefits from global expansions will be achieved more easily through the creation of structures that lead to those kinds of outcomes. Right? So, for example, are we going to leverage up our skills and core capabilities through the international expansion? Right? For a company that's well known for our technology, let's spread that technology throughout the world and thereby use that same technology as our core distinctive advantage for our competition in different markets? Or is it something that we need to scale up, or where we can scale up? And by scaling up, we can gain economies of scale, or we can gain location-based economies. In other words, we have a multinational network that touches on knowledge or customers in multiple different segments, and thereby that information from those multiple segments feeds into our different advantages. Or can we gain productive scope so that we can gain learning curve economies or have other learning effects? And this is where the scale comes in that I mentioned previously. Will those be advantageous to us? Okay, those are some general statements. They'll become more specific as I proceed through this particular online lecture and the next one. But those are some of the general underlays that will become more specific. So we're moving from a situation of somewhat conceptual ambiguity or conceptual generality to one of to more specific conceptions of ideas and then examples. And that's how we'll reinforce these points that I'm talking about today. So when we think about flat versus spiky, we can recast those ideas in the global strategy and structure debate in terms of what pressures exist for a global strategy, in other words, the world is flat, or what pressures exist for national responsiveness, in other words, the world is spiky and each country is different. Right? If we have global or multinational customers, it's a flat world. If we're following our customers across different markets, we're a consulting firm or whatever, and we're moving around the world with our customers, or we're a bank serving our customers, our corporate customers in different markets, hey, then that's a strategy that forces us to move into different markets internationally. Same customer operating in different markets, maybe some changes to how we service the customer, but still because it is a customer that we've known from our home market, then it's not that difficult to move into international markets with that company. Maybe we have to, for example, engage in a lot of R&D to develop our products. Pharmaceutical companies are pretty much noted for this, right? They've spent a lot of money on developing new molecules, new science that can yield new drugs that hopefully have universal application across a populace. Spending all that money on research and development and then leveraging it in just one national market does not make a lot of sense, right? If we take that same technology and spread it across multiple markets, spread it across the world, then the amount of technology cost associated with each unit of production goes down because we kept the denominator the same, which is the cost of technology development, while we've expanded the numerator, which is the number of customers we serve. Classic economies of scale. Hence, economies of scale is a very common logic for explaining why we might have a globalized strategy, globalized production, and consequently a global production. Naturally, when we think about pressures for local responsiveness, national responsiveness, they all amate to differences. Could be differences in regulatory environments, could be differences in customers, could be differences in the kinds of product adaptations we have to make, could be differences in productive processes, could be that the country is in a different stage of the product cycle. Multiple kinds of differences can emerge either upstream or downstream that can affect the need for national responsiveness. And this is why I say our arguments are about which strategy is appropriate depends so much on the individual context of the company, because every company will experience different levels of pressures for global strategy or national responsiveness depending on how flat or spiky these different dimensions are. The critical part is to think about which are important and which ones you're going to attend to through your strategy. Because when we are moving internationally, we'll face a number of different challenges that are related to those multiplicity and diversity of products, competitors, and so forth, all the dimensions of our environment. Never will we have the same set of competitive conditions across different markets that we compete in. Now again, it's the nature of whether or not those differences lead to the need to adapt to, in important ways, to competition in each market, which is the national responsiveness. If it doesn't, then c'est la vie. Yes, there are differences, but we can moderate those differences with little disruption by maintaining a fairly homogeneous strategy. So we have to think about how these various kinds of issues that relate to management strategy, how we have management of a global firm, how we connect to different markets, how we connect subsidiaries, what kind of commitments we make to those subsidiaries, what kind of independence we grant them. All of these are very, very important management issues, but they begin with the core issue, which is, are we going to be more focused on global, or are we going to be focused on more local? Global expansion doesn't necessarily suggest only global. Global expansion can be related to local, right? Localized across different markets, but still fundamentally a global organization. Then when we do this, we think about what kind of coordination do we need? And that's the critical next step. Once we decide whether we're going to be more or less global in our strategy or more or less responsive in our international strategy, then we think about how to organize the activities. What kind of coordination do we have between subsidiaries? What kind of responsibilities do the subsidiaries have? And ultimately, who has control in a lot of the decisions that are necessary to make? So this is where we get this classic grid between these two dimensions, where we have, one, the forces of global integration, and number two, the forces for national responsiveness. And then we can consequently, depending on where an organization falls along these different dimensions, or where its industry falls along these different dimensions, decide on which kind of structure is best, which then guides the kinds of relationships we have with the subsidiaries, what kind of responsibilities we give to subsidiary managers, and all sorts of other elements that relate to the management of a very complex entity. If we believe that the forces for national responsiveness are low and the forces for global integration are reasonably low, then we end up with what we call an international strategy model. And this is the model where we allow each subsidiary to have a lot of autonomy. And basically the way the core operation is, we just transfer something to local subsidiary and say, go ahead and do it. International sits as a companion organization to the main domestic model, but at the end of the day, each of these host country subsidiaries has a lot of autonomy in what they do and are fundamentally replicas of the main operations of the subsidiary, of the headquarters. So there's not a lot of integration, it's just coordinated federation. We can have like the same branding, the same kinds of products, but how they go about it in that country is entirely up to the subsidiaries' managers. The main thing that the headquarters coordinates are the transfer of knowledge to the subsidiaries and then the repatriation of profits to the overall corporation. If we have a model where there's a slightly higher need for global integration, but still not a lot of need for local responsiveness, in other words, a fairly flat world, not too spiky, but with some spikes in it, then we get, more or less a flat world, very few spikes. Then we get to the idea of what we call centralized hubs. And this is the global strategy model. This is the global strategy model. This is where we compete through global efficiency. And we situate subsidiaries across the world to where they'll have their best use, be it an operating subsidiary or a manufacturing subsidiary. Maybe we distribute manufacturing across the world, much as what the shoe, footwear manufacturers have done, where they place different productive activities in different markets and then assemble them all in another market. But this is based on the premise that we leverage the advantages of each market to its greatest degree, and we have tight coordination from the headquarters to enable everything to fit together. Because each piece, each host country operation, each individual international subsidiary is insufficient in and of itself to produce the whole. Hence, we have a widely distributed network of operations. Again, could be upstream or downstream, but tightly controlled and linked through the headquarters. That's why we call it centralized hubs. We have all the hub models centralized through the entity. Then again, we could get to what we call a decentralized federation. Decentralized federation. This is even more dispersed than the centralized federation I mentioned earlier. In this particular model, which we can call the multinational strategy model, we think the world is very spiky. And so as a consequence, we must be maximally nationally responsive. Maximally nationally responsive. So headquarters just gives a mandate to the subsidiaries to do what they want within the general context of the multinational firm in those individual markets. You need to tailor the product to the consumers, go ahead and do it. We have no standard operational model. We don't have standard pricing across markets. We do what is ever best to support those customers in that market. You can see, for example, in that particular kind of setting, that the subsidiaries' general managers in each of those host country markets for the decentralized federation or the multinational strategy model have a lot of power. They have a lot of power. They might have reporting responsibilities to the headquarters, but at the end of the day, operational decisions, strategic decisions are situated with them. That's what we mean by decentralized federation. They pay their tax, their tithe to the headquarters, but how they achieve those earnings, fully up to them. Fully up to them. Now, when we think about this, we can see that another way to think about these ideas is that along these local responses, global integration, is that we can see this kind of cascade of ideas. In a global strategy where the world is flat, we treat the world as a single integrated strategic unit. In an international strategy, overseas operations are offshoots of domestic strategy, and they're just sitting there to kind of like grab extra revenues, but they're not fundamental to the overall strategy creation of the firm. So yes, international strategy is more like a revenue augmentation idea, and I'll pick up on this idea in subsequent lectures, but it's not really, or subsequent discussions, but it's not really, international in this model, does not really sit as a critical element to the overall strategy of the firm. It's more kind of a secondary nature. Then we get to the multinational strategy, which is really where we treat the world as a portfolio of national markets. So we have all of these individual markets, and again, we have this decentralization where the idea is to, again, pull revenues from multiple markets based upon the core product offerings as adapted to those markets as best as possible through the leadership of the country subsidiaries or the managers in the country subsidiaries, right? So these three dimensions, they vary across their local responsiveness and global integration. But then the question is, what if we get to that upper quadrant where we want to be both globally integrated at a high level, but we also want to be maximally locally responsive at a high level? And this is where we get something that's called the transnational solution. The transnational solution, where we begin to conceive of not only centralizing the depth and strength of communications through the headquarters, but we begin to think of the multinational firm as a network of operations. And this way we begin to foster communications not only between the headquarters and each host country subsidiary, but between each of the individual subsidiaries. And so we can have some kind of communication channel between subsidiary X and subsidiary Y in these different markets. For example, if we look at, let's take an example of OCBC or DBS Bank. Both are regionalizing their operations. Both are regionalizing their operations currently. They're building out operations in Greater China. DBS is going a bit more into India. OCBC is going a bit more into perhaps Indonesia and Malaysia, but still the central HQ for the banking operations, even though they might have a few more operations such as insurance with OCBC Bank. They're building out their banking operations with a primary emphasis in Singapore. I think OCBC still has 50% of its revenues as a group coming from Singapore, and DBS Bank about 2/3. So Singapore is HQ, it's home, right? They might have some coordination between Singapore market and Greater China, or between Indonesia, or with India and so forth. But what happens if, for example, in OCBC Bank, Indonesia starts talking to the Hong Kong operational units, both of which were acquired units in OCBC Bank? That's when we start to see more of a transnational solution. When instructions and guidance and products are not only mediated from the central core, but also occur between different units. Maybe the Indonesian bank comes up with a unique form of a banking card, or a unique kind of app that can be used to mediate insurance when providing car financing, automotive financing, for example. That's when ideas can be shared across different units. necessarily this is a very complicated structure. There's going to be formal and informal rules of communications. A lot of this informal has to be fostered through the creation of social networks within the company that are not really dictated in the official organizational structure. But that's the reality of the transnational company, right? So one of the key features of the transnational company is that business units are part of a network, right? So we have these reciprocal dependencies across these business units. There's a dominance, but there's not a dominance, right? So headquarters is important, but it's no longer dominant or fundamental to all communications, right? We still have some clearly defined communications, but we must have good interpersonal relationships. We have to have systems that are built up to connect managers in similar functions, in similar business units across different geographies. They have to know what the others are doing so that they have to know each other so that they're more likely to share information and build those reciprocal interdependencies. So this requires active participation of managers at the subsidiary level, and it must also develop a culture, an organizational culture of sharing and willingness to collaborate. So now you can see all those other elements of structure begin to emerge, of implementation begin to emerge alongside organizational structure. We have to think about not only structure, but systems, processes, incentives, culture that can motivate this kind of off-structure relationship building that is so necessary to build that dense network of communications that is fundamental to the success of the transnational company. But when doing this, there's more uncertainty about what needs to be done. For example, there's the idea of role ambiguity. Now you have people operating in matrix structures where, yes, they might report to their boss, but hey, do they have to think, do I have to respond to my colleague over, if I'm in Indonesia, do I have to respond to my colleague in Kuala Lumpur who's asking me for something? Is there a dual pressure? Is there, who's my boss? What should I prioritize? How should I know what I'm able to do? How do I resolve this? It could also lead to some kind of dilution in terms of responsibilities. Hey, who was responsible for that decision? Why did we do this? Was it the manager in Indonesia? Was it the manager in Malaysia? Was it the CEO of the Malaysian operations? Who knows? There's definitely going to be bigger coordination costs. We have to create all sorts of systems as well as practices, travel, communication. Zoom's not going to solve everything, that lead to this bonding and understanding between people dispersed in different units in different geographies. Could be turf battles as well if we let it become highly politicized, and there's going to be compromises that have to be made. Maybe it's not optimal for your market, but if you can see the bigger picture, maybe it's optimal for the coordination, the company as a whole. So we want to summarize where we are today, and I just have a couple more points that I want to make. We can see that these different strategies, which I've recast now across the federation and so forth in terms of these ideas, international, multinational, global, and transnational, have different sets of advantages and disadvantages. And the advantages or disadvantages play out more prominently in the decision about which to use at this particular point in time, depending on how flat or spiky you see the world to be. How flat or spiky the world you perceive it to be, then how important those are, yields the idea about what we should be using at this particular time as our model or our structure for organizing our operations. Here's a summary of the structural considerations of the global strategy, right? Again, need for global integration, need for national responsiveness. Notice I flipped the axes to keep you on your toes. Yields either to a global strategy if responsiveness is low and global integration is high, world is flat. If it's very spiky, we go for the multinational strategy. If it's neither nor and international is just kind of like an appendum to our operations, then we go with the international strategy. But if it's both flat in some ways and spiky in other ways, then we have to think about, hey, can we come up with kind of a hybrid solution, a kind of transnational solution, which is organizationally complex, really challenging to implement, but if it works, you have a really powerful organization, a really powerful organization. Now, which is the right one is not for me to decide, clearly, but hopefully what I've laid out today in this 30 to 40 minutes has helped to identify what are some of the key considerations behind the design of structure for multinational firms. Thank you very much. That's all I have for today. Thank you.